I'd like for us to spend a few minutes together talking about Deuteronomy chapter 8. And really, it focuses on the blessings that are to be found in living a faithful life. Deuteronomy is the message that Moses gives to this new generation of Israelites poised to go into the promised land. So a lot of things actually are repetitive from what has been spoken to their parents and grandparents who died in the wilderness. But this is a new generation of Israelites. Here in Deuteronomy chapter 8, this is what Moses says. Every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land of the Lord, which the Lord swore to your fathers. And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So he humbled you and allowed you to hunger. He fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but that man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. Down in verse 7 and following, the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs that flow of valleys and hills. A land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees, pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. A land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing. A land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. And when you've eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full, and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is filled up, lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness in which were fiery serpents and scorpions, thirsty land. The whole chapter deals with what they need to expect, but what they need to remember. So we take away things out of this chapter, the blessings that are found in living a faithful life. What do we find? Well, back at the very beginning, back in chapter 2, Moses said, you need to remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. There are at least two things involved in this verse. And the first one, really, that the faithful life is a life that's under the guidance of God. The Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness. And even that statement, just the fact that they were wandering for so long, had to remind them, even this new generation, that the wandering was not because of God, but because of the unbelief of their parents and their grandparents that caused them to grow up in the wilderness. The guidance that we have from God, you think of what is inspiring us as Christians, that really coincides with what you find here in Deuteronomy chapter 8. We still live a life under the guidance of God. Remember the statement that Jesus made in John chapter 10, that he's the good shepherd, and there's very illustrative verses surrounding that concept. He feeds his sheep. His sheep hear his voice and they follow him. The guidance of God is something that is incontestable. But the second thing in verse 2 is the fact that God led them through those years to humble them and test them, to know what was in their heart. The statement that's made in James chapter 1 about the testing of our faith, the patience that is produced because of those tests that we have to face in life. It's something that's not lost here in Deuteronomy 8 or in those passages elsewhere in the New Testament that deal with the faith that we have, that is something that's strengthened through the difficulties of life. To humble you, to test you, what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And then in verse number 3, besides the guidance from God, besides the humility that is found in the testing process, in verse number 3, he humbled you and allowed you to hunger and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know. The blessings of faithful life are that guidance under God that is ours and is a blessing in our life. The blessings of the faithful life deal with the humility that we have to have before God, which is exhibited both in verse 2 and verse 3. But also in verse 3, the statement is made that God fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know. He allowed you to hunger, and then he fed you with manna. It's a life sustained by God. But in the process of that taking place, in the process of God's blessings to this nation of Israelites, and ultimately to us, there are times of hunger that we face. There are difficulties that cause us to know that there is something we maybe cannot provide on our own, that God in his mercy and his power actually does give and does provide. So the blessings of this faithful life in Jeremiah chapter 8, we've got a life of guidance from God. We have a life of humility before God. We have a life that is sustained by God. And also in chapter 3, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. The fourth point, the second one here in verse 3. We are not in this providing for ourselves without having a dependence upon God. This particular verse, the latter part of verse number 3, was something that was quoted by Jesus in Matthew chapter 4 and verse 4, and the temptations that Jesus faced from Satan in the wilderness. Man lives not by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. When Paul wrote to the Christians in Thessalonica, in 1 Thessalonians, the second chapter, he told them that when you received the word from us, you didn't receive it as a word from people or a word from your man. You received it as it was in truth, God's word. And that's something that we have to remember. The principles that keep us founded in the relationships we have with family, with friends, the way we respond to situations in culture and society are very much ingrained in what God actually has provided for us. Those principles, those ethics, it is very much the case that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. In the fifth place, we jump down to verse 7, 8, and 9. The Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains, springs that flow out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, a land, in verse 9, in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron and out of whose hills you can dig copper. The statement made in these verses deals with the hope that they possess. It's not just a promise, it's something that actually has been validated from those spies that went in to take a look at that promised land so many years previous to this young generation ready to go in and take that promised land. They remember the accounts. They've heard them for the most of their life. All of the things that that land provides. The hope is that they will be the ones that possess it. Hope that we have in God is something that still is very much a marker of that faithful life. Without hope, what kind of point is there to life in the first place? But here Moses reminds them of what God has provided, that they must go in and take. But the hope that they have of all of those blessings that they've heard of for decades is still very much present. The hope that we have is still something that helps keep us grounded. Point number 6. Down in verse 10 and following. When you've eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. The blessings of the faithful life are blessings where we praise the one that provided all of those things for us. Here they are reminded that when you go in and you possess this land and you live in those houses that you didn't build, you eat fruit and vegetables out of those gardens and orchards that you did not plant. Give thanks to God. Bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. And then down into verse number 18. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he swore to your fathers as it is this day. Now between verse 10 and verse 18, he deals with all the reasons for that blessing and that praise and reminds them that when they have all of this prosperity, don't forget God. And one of the reasons that kind of wraps up this chapter in verse 18, remember that's the Lord your God that gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he swore to your fathers, as it is this day. Besides that praise to God, besides that thanksgiving, is recognition in this faithful life that we are empowered by God to accomplish these things. It's not something that we do on our own. That's not to say that when something doesn't go tremendously well that it is wrong for somebody to pat you on the back and tell you what a good job that you did. It is something that we need to remind ourselves, though, that we do not do this on our own. God is the one that's provided everything that we have in this life. God is the one that needs to be praised, but above all, God needs to be remembered. 7 different items in chapter 8 of Deuteronomy. Blessings that are found in living that faithful life. Blessings that are vital to this new generation of Israelites going into that promised land, but points that are vital to us. Blessings that we have as we live that faithful life in Christ. Stay safe. We'll talk again soon.